The Hundred Years' War was not a single, continuous conflict, but a prolonged contest of dynastic claims, shifting alliances, and military innovation that reshaped both England and France. It began in 1337 and drew to a decisive close in 1453, a span of time that saw the decline of medieval chivalry, the rise of professional armies, and the early formation of modern states. This is the story of how contested succession, economic entanglement, and evolving warfare produced a transformation whose echoes reach far beyond the battlefields. The war begins with a succession crisis. When Charles IV of France died in 1328 without a male heir, the question of legitimate succession became the center of international politics. Edward III of England, grandson of Philip IV of France through his mother, pressed a claim to the French throne. The French nobility rejected that claim, invoking a principle that effectively excluded inheritance through the female line and placed Philip VI, the first Valois king, on the throne. This was more than a quarrel over crowns. It was a collision of legal precedent, dynastic ambition, and the economic interests that linked English and continental markets. Real escalation followed when Philip VI asserted authority over Aquitaine, a region in southwestern France that had been under English overlordship for generations. The seizure of Aquitaine in 1337 transformed a dispute of lineage into a struggle over territory and sovereignty. Edward revived his dynastic claim not only as a matter of prestige, but as a tool to reclaim political leverage and economic access. With that, a long war was set in motion. The first phase of the war belonged to England. Naval superiority, mobile campaigning, and tactical innovations produced a string of dramatic victories. In 1340, the English destroyed the French fleet at Sluys, giving them control of the Channel long enough to sustain cross-channel operations. That control culminated in 1346 at Crécy, where English longbowmen, disciplined, coordinated, and strategically placed, reshaped expectations about the battlefield. The charge of heavy cavalry, long the defining instrument of martial prestige, faltered before the dense advance of arrows and the calculating use of terrain. Crécy signaled a change in military balance. Following Crécy, Edward's forces seized Calais after a prolonged siege. Calais became England's gateway to the continent, a supply base and a statement of enduring ambition. In 1356, the Black Prince, Edward's son, won another decisive victory at Poitiers, capturing King John II of France. The ransom and political fallout produced the Treaty of Bretigny in 1360, a high water mark for English territorial gains and a pause in direct claims to the French crown, exchanged for sovereignty over substantial holdings. Yet these gains were costly to hold, and their persistence depended on permanent military expenditure and political stability at home. Where England relied on the longbow, mobility, and opportunistic strategy, France eventually adapted on a different axis. The accession of Charles V in 1364 marked a strategic reorientation. Rather than risking pitched battles, Charles favored attrition, diplomacy, and a more professionalized approach to warfare. Under the guidance of commanders like Bertrand du Guesclin, the French employed a defensive, harassment-centric doctrine. Small, agile forces, fortified garrisons, and targeted offensives gradually eroded English gains. By the end of Charles V's reign, much of the territory won at Bretigny had been recovered. That recovery was not merely military, it required taxation reforms and administrative consolidation that strengthened royal capacity. Control of towns depended on garrisons and funds, not merely on battlefield triumphs. The conflict also incubated social strain. Repeated levies, requisitions, and the disruptions of trade eroded trust in royal authority on both sides of the Channel. Internal crises accelerated the war's unpredictability. The reign of Charles VI brought catastrophe through the king's recurring insanity. His incapacity opened a vacuum filled by competing factions, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. Rivalries rooted in regional interests and personal ambitions spilled into violence. In 1407, the assassination of the Duke of Orléans, attributed to Burgundian enemies, ignited civil war. Paris and its suburbs became arenas of factional conflict, and the French crown, physically and morally fractured, could not present unified resistance. The English recognized opportunity in the chaos. A decisive new phase began with Henry V of England. Henry combined political acumen with battlefield command. In 1415, he launched the campaign that produced Agincourt, an engagement that entered into legend. Despite being outnumbered and weathered by an exhausting march, the English deployed with tactical discipline on terrain that neutralized French cavalry. Once again, longbowmen and firm infantry formations inflicted catastrophic losses on the French nobility. The shock of Agincourt reverberated across Europe, and Henry's subsequent diplomacy turned battlefield advantage into political leverage. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 formalized that leverage. It disinherited the Dauphin and recognized Henry as heir to the French crown. Henry's marriage to Catherine of Valois symbolized the treaty's intent. Yet the plan depended on continuity. It unraveled less than 2 years after Henry's death in 1422 and the subsequent death of Charles VI. England was left with an infant king nominally recognized in France, a divided realm and a fragile coalition that included the Burgundians. Meanwhile, the Dauphin, who declared himself Charles VII, refused the treaty and maintained resistance from the south. The result was a contested sovereignty and a battlefield once again open to decisive change. If the English had relied on conventional military power and diplomatic settlements, France found an unlikely catalyst in a peasant girl from Domremy. Joan of Arc emerged in 1429 with a personal conviction of divine mission and the political instinct to focus on legitimacy. Her arrival at the Siege of Orléans lifted morale and changed the political arithmetic. Within months, the siege was broken and Charles VII was crowned at Reims, the traditional site of French coronation. Joan's charismatic leadership was decisive not just for its tactical effects, but for the symbolic restoration of royal legitimacy. Her capture in 1430 and execution in 1431 turned her into a martyr, solidifying French unity and resolve. Joan's martyrdom did not mark the end of the war. Rather, it signaled a turning point. The consolidation of Burgundian reconciliation with Charles VII in the Treaty of Arras in 1435 removed a major ally of the English and restored political coherence to the French cause. Charles VII pursued substantive reforms, building a standing army funded by a more reliable taxation structure, reorganizing finances, and relying on professional officers rather than feudal levies alone. These administrative changes enabled sustained strategic offensives rather than episodic raids. Technological change allied with organizational reform to seal English fortunes. By the mid-15th century, artillery and gunpowder were increasingly decisive. Field artillery, trained gunners, and improved siege techniques rendered traditional fortifications vulnerable and changed commanders' calculus. At Formigny in 1450 and decisively at Castillon in 1453, French artillery inflicted crippling losses on English forces. The Battle of Castillon, in particular, combined an effective artillery deployment with a well-prepared defensive position, producing a rout that effectively extinguished English power in Gascony. With the fall of Bordeaux, the English presence on the continent was reduced to Calais, and even that foothold would not endure the century. When the last major campaigns concluded, the war left altered political landscapes. In France, monarchical authority emerged strengthened. The crown now possessed the fiscal mechanisms to maintain standing forces and govern more directly. France's reconquest forged a nascent national identity grounded in the restored power of the king. In England, the long struggle drained resources and undermined dynastic credibility. Losses abroad contributed to internal instability that erupted into the Wars of the Roses in the later 15th century. The English crown turned inward, its continental ambitions replaced by domestic contest and maritime expansion. If we look forward from the 15th century, the conflict offers lessons about state capacity, the interaction between technology and institutions, and the unpredictable role of individual agency. Leadership matters. The successes of Edward III and Henry V show how military competence and political will can convert opportunity into short-term triumph. Conversely, the restorative policies of Charles V and Charles VII demonstrate that recovery and consolidation rest on institutional reform as much as battlefield victories. Joan of Arc shows the potency of legitimacy and symbolism when institutions falter. Technological change, from the longbow to the cannon, reveals that military transformations are rarely instantaneous. They require adaptation in logistics, finance, and command. There are cautionary lessons as well. The Hundred Years' War demonstrates the cost of entangling dynastic claims with economic interests and how factionalism can distort national strategy. The Burgundian-Armagnac rivalry shows that internal division amplifies external threats. The English experience warns against overextension when political will and finances cannot be sustained. In our contemporary terms, when political legitimacy and resource allocation misalign, strategic outcomes become precarious. To summarize, the Hundred Years' War began as a dynastic dispute, became an extended contest over territory and sovereignty, and concluded with the ascendancy of French royal power and the retraction of English continental ambition. Across the century-plus of conflict, Europe witnessed the decline of feudal levies, the evolution of battlefield technology, and the strengthening of centralized administrations. These changes jointly propelled medieval polities toward the structures that would define the early modern age. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of history's most defining moments. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and click the bell icon so you never miss another deep dive into our past.